Welcome back, everyone. I'm very pleased to have our next speaker presenting. Annie Laurie Gaylor is our next speaker. In addition to being co-founder and co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Annie Laurie comes to the Conference on Religious Trauma highly recommended as an accomplished writer on matters pertaining to women and religion. Today, Annie Laurie will tell us why women need freedom from religion. Welcome, Annie Laurie Gaylor.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I would like to talk about religious trauma and women from a more general perspective. I'm prefacing this by noting for the record that I am not a therapist, nor have I experienced personal religious trauma. I'll be approaching this as co-founder of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, where I have met untold individuals who have fought and thought their way out of religion. And I've studied sexism in religion and the historic role of women in the Freethought community in working to free women from the religious ties that bind and often traumatize women. And since this is a heavy topic, I thought I would start with a joke. And it's a joke about a woman who is solo climbing on a mountain with rappels, and she trips and somehow something goes wrong with her gear, and she finds herself dangling from a rope with a cliff ahead of her and hundreds of feet from the ground. And she starts screaming and yelling, "Is anybody up there? Is anybody up there?" And a booming baritone voice calls out from above, "I'm here, my child." And she looks up and she can't see anybody. "Who are you? Where are you?" "I'm God," the voice replies. "Thank God I'm saved," she says. And then the voice continues, "Listen to me carefully, my child. I'm going to save you. But first, you have to show your faith." "How?" she asks. "By letting go of the rope." She's hanging on. She looks down. She looks up. And then she pauses and says, "Is anybody else up there?" So I don't know if you've heard that joke, but I think it's very apropos. It's the position that a lot of religious people find themselves in when they are at the end of their rope. And religion asks everything of us and gives us nothing in return. So I do want to preface, as I said, something about myself. I'm fortunate to be a third-generation freethinker on my mother's side of the family. On my maternal side, we seem not to have inherited the God gene. On my father's side of the family, he was brought up, he's a first-generation freethinker, was a first-generation freethinker. He was brought up in the Christian church, Disciples of Christ, and his family tried to convert him too hard. Even into his 80s, at the end of his years, he remained indignant and embarrassed about the full-body immersion he was subjected to at the age of 12 in a baptism in front of the entire congregation. This is one of those churches where they made you take all your clothes off and put the robe on and dunked you in front of everyone. And that for him was the last straw. Religion never took, but he never forgot the hypocrisy and the racism in his Missouri church and what he had been subjected to in his youth. But so my parents were united as non-religious people, and they had a philosophy about how to treat children. My mother didn't like the term raise. There were two things, and I'm going to concentrate mostly on the first. My parents believed devoutly that children should be allowed to grow up free of religion until they are old enough to understand religious claims and abstractions and make up their own minds for themselves. They respected our minds, they respected our integrity, and they respected our innocence. And I'm reminded of a quote from The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. He said, "Any system of religion that has anything in it that shocks the mind of a child cannot be true." So my parents would no more have shocked our minds by indoctrinating us in religious dogmas than they would have shocked us by exposing us to brutality or sadism. They held sacred our freedom to grow up unimpeded by hoary old dogmas. What Bertrand Russell, I love this quote, called ideas uttered long ago by ignorant men. Ideas that inculcate shame, fear, neuroses, and reward faith without evidence. My parents believed, as I do, that a parent's job is to equip your child to grow up and take care of themselves, and that necessitates protecting children from harm, and that includes the harm of religious teachings. In our still overwhelmingly religious society, we inoculate our children from disease, I hope, then at early ages infect them with the virus of religion. We tell them they're precious, then the Bible tells them they're rotten. We childproof our homes, but think nothing of exposing children to harmful, frightening doctrines. We even read them biblical stories of genocide, such as the story of Noah's Ark, as entertainment. We wouldn't take them to an R-rated movie, but we give them an X-rated book and tell them it's good. We teach them stranger danger, but then we take them to Sunday school or church to be preyed upon, and I'm spelling preyed with both ways. We provide nutritious meals so they stay healthy, then imbibe them with a steady diet of toxic concepts. We wipe their noses, bandage their scratches, croon them to sleep with loving lullabies. Then we tell them they were born into sin. We tell our children the day they were born was the happiest moment of our lives. Then we expose them to teachings that they are depraved. We try to shield them from violence. Then we show them images of a man being tortured and then tell our children it's all their fault. He died. Vicarious redemption is one of many religious abstractions even adults cannot make sense of. How can we expect children to? And then, of course, there is the concept of heaven, pie in the sky when you die, where we tell children all the people born into the right religion go, while those born into the wrong religion deserve to go to hell. The great feminist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, at age 80, wrote in her autobiography, "I can truly say that all the cares and anxieties, the trials and disappointments of my whole life are light when balanced with my sufferings in childhood and youth from the theological dogmas which I sincerely believed. The memory of my own suffering has prevented me from ever shadowing one young soul with any of the superstitions of the Christian religion." Hell isn't just a 19th century trauma or even a purely fundamentalist inflicted trauma, as I'm sure is no surprise to folks at this conference. Still, in the United States, where I'm from, 58% of Americans say they believe in hell. One presumes many or most of them are parents or grandparents who are still shadowing young souls with the superstitions of the Christian religion. And isn't it a form of child abuse when mommy or daddy, the person a child depends on for love, for life, for everything, for survival, teaches them these doctrines of Christianity, that they are innately sinful and in need of salvation? That a devil exists whose sole purpose is to tempt them, and if they give in, they'll spend an eternity in hell being tortured. Isn't this mind molestation? And I'm addressing mind molestation. I'm not talking about the epidemic of sexual abuse in churches or synagogues, but I do want to segue that this ongoing crisis stems in part from pernicious church teachings that pastors and priests are next to God, from the self-fulfilling prophecy of sin, and also because our society has treated ministers and churches as above the law for far too long. And the second principle that my non-religious parents subscribed to about taking care of children, they always said we raised ourselves, so they didn't like that term child rearing or raising, but about taking care of children, is the duty to model and encourage critical thinking skills. Martin Luther said, Whoever wants to be a Christian should tear the reason out of his eyes. As freethinkers, my parents expected us to use reason in forming our opinions about religion, not faith, tradition, or authority. And that's a beautiful concept that cannot traumatize any child. And we can see in the midst of this pandemic the harm of a society that devalues critical thinking skills, the science denial. We can see in the midst of January 6th at the US Capitol, the QAnon's conspiracies, the big lie that Trump really won the election, the harm of conflating what you want to believe is true versus what is really true, what there is evidence to believe. And we have a bumper sticker I like at the Freedom from Religion Foundation that is apropos: religion, the original fake news. And now on to the real topic of my talk, which is the harm of religion to women. So I know Dan Barker has already spoken. Some of you heard him yesterday. He's my husband. And we recently had an opportunity, a very fun opportunity, to do a remote TV interview with Robin Morgan. Some of you may know that name. She's a legendary feminist icon. She wrote Sisterhood is Powerful. She was a longtime editor of Ms. Magazine. And as a wise feminist, she's 80. She's also a stalwart as an atheist. And I love this one-liner that she delivered during our interview. Robin Morgan said, "I like to say that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to respect religion and respect women at the same time." And that really says it. The root problem is that none of the major religions, which are all patriarchal, respects women. As the 19th and 20th, early 20th century feminist Charlotte Perkins Gilman noted, one religion after another has accepted and perpetuated man's original mistake in making a private servant of the mother of the race. In the Christian-dominated Western world, two Bible verses in particular sum up the position of women. "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." By the 3rd chapter of Genesis, woman lost her rights, her standing, and even her identity, and motherhood became a God-inflicted curse, degrading her status in the world. In the New Testament, the Bible decrees, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman, being deceived, was in the transgression." And as another FFRF bumper sticker puts it, Eve was framed. Women are and were and are blamed for bringing sin and death into the world. The Bible teaches a master-servant relationship between men and women. The holy hierarchy is God on top, then Jesus, then man, and then there at the very bottom, woman. Women in the Bible are property and possessions. They are required to be subservient. They're war booty. They're rapeable, sacrificeable, branded as whores and harlots, whom the biblical deity discovers with their skirts upon their faces. Horrible imagery. They are sin-inciting temptresses, Jezebels, and unclean. In speaking of the degrading way that religion refers to women's life-producing menstrual periods, there is a welcome worldwide movement now for what is called period equity or menstrual equity. There is a growing awareness of how many girls are traumatized by their lack of period equity. They miss school during their menstrual cycle due to a lack of sanitary products, lack of information and support, even in North America, but it can be the end of their school career or job careers in many other countries. The Bible calls menstruation a curse and patriarchal religions have certainly tried to make it one. So basically, the Bible is a handbook for women's subjugation. And speaking personally, I found it very traumatic when I read it cover to cover. So although I never imbibed religion personally, that doesn't mean that those of us who are not religious are not traumatized by its teachings and its impact on society. And you can refer to a brochure that we produce. We call it a non-tract. The idea is it's something to hand to the Jehovah Witnesses or other people going door to door with their tracts. So it's a non-tract. We have one called Why Women Need Freedom from Religion. So if you want the shorthand version, you can find that up at our website. It's under the books link. You can read it for free. Or I also have written a book, Woe to the Women, The Bible Tells Me So, and that's available at FFRF's website, ffrf.org shop. You don't have to be a masochist and read the whole thing like I did and be traumatized. This kind of gives you the blow-by-blow descriptions of what the Bible really says about women. And what it says isn't very good. And women only make up about 10% of the Bible. So clearly, any fundamentalist sect, whether Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, can look to the biblical and Quranic rules they share in common to denounce and control women, women's fertility, and women's lives. And of course, we also see the shaming and devaluing of women by Hinduism. Looking domestically in the United States, and that's where we're located, that's where the Freedom from Religion Foundation has our work cut out for us, we see the heavy hand that religion continues to play in oppressing women, in trying to legislate dogma, and threatening our hard-gained rights. And uppermost is reproductive rights. And I should add that the Freedom from Religion Foundation only exists because my mother, its principal founder, was an early advocate for abortion rights. And I was following her around as a junior high school student back in the 1960s and early 1970s when she spoke and lobbied and worked to legalize abortion in the United States. And it became very obvious to us, we soon realized that the only organized opposition to abortion is religious in nature. It opened our eyes to the danger of religion ever being legislated into our civil laws or social policy. And the lesson that we learned is why we co-founded the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It was in 1976 as a local group when I was a college student, went national in 1978. It could have been something else that opened our eyes, but that was it for us. The anti-abortion movement is a religious crusade, of course, to force a religious concept, ensoulment, upon the rest of us. But more than that, it's a religious crusade to control women. If you can't decide if and whether to become a parent or continue a pregnancy or not, you cannot control your destiny. The Bible doesn't really address abortion, of course, but it is profoundly anti-woman. And thankfully, because of Roe versus Wade in the United States, a 1973 decision that legalized abortion around the nation, our society has moved past a time when unwed motherhood was an enormous stigma. I still remember when, as a girl, reading the newspapers, they were routinely full of cases of infanticide. These were usually tragic cases involving teenagers who hid their pregnancies in shame and panicked after giving birth alone, terrified. So we've moved past those bad ideas. We've moved past those bad old days. And when the only alternative to abortion was motherhood, madness, or suicide, as President Jimmy Carter's commission concluded back in the 1970s regarding alternatives to legal abortion. The trauma created by unwanted pregnancy has been greatly reduced wherever it is legal, thanks to secular principles prevailing in healthcare, not religious doctrine. But women's autonomy and Roe versus Wade are threatened more and more thanks to this continuing religious war against abortion. Religious state legislatures this year in the United States have already introduced more than 500 anti-abortion bills restricting abortion care. Just in the month of April, U.S. governors in Montana, Arizona, South Dakota, Wyoming, Oklahoma, and Idaho have signed sweeping anti-abortion legislation that severely restricts abortion care, joining a number of other states that have enacted similar unconstitutional bans on abortion care. These laws are intended to go before the increasingly hostile Supreme Court, where, they hope, Roe v. Wade will be overturned. And almost always, the bill sponsors invoke God and religion. As we have another bumper sticker I've shown tell, as this bumper sticker says, "Keep your theology off my biology." I'd like to also say something briefly about what my mother, Anne Gaylor, used to refer to as the religious battered woman syndrome. Many pastoral counselors, not necessarily limited to fundamentalists or Catholics, counsel women to stay in abusive relationships and marriages, to obey their husbands, and they essentially blame the victims. In the United States, the other hot button issue of the day is transgender girls participating in sports at the public school level. We're talking about mostly middle school and high school, amateur sports, done for fitness and for team spirit. This has become a religious crusade. It's phony as all can be because there are very few cases where this even comes up, but religious fanatics and Christian nationalists who cannot accept the Obergefell decision by the Supreme Court that approved marriage equality in the United States are now obsessed with transgender. Their Bible calls for stoning gays. It calls men who wear women's garments and vice versa abominations. So I don't need to tell you, I'm sure, the trauma inflicted by fundamentalist religion upon LGBTQ citizens. And I can't, in the time left, do a survey on all the harm and trauma inflicted by religion on women around the world and in history. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the latest massacre on Saturday of young female students by Muslim extremists in Afghanistan. I know you all read the terrible news by terrorists who oppose women's educational rights. They opposed them for years and have created so much terror over the years. More than 50, maybe 80 people have died. We're still getting disparate figures. These were mostly girls, low-income girls, under the age of 15, eager to learn. There were explosions outside a secondary school in Kabul. One explosion was crafted to get the girls to run outside where they could then be killed in other explosions. More than 150 people were injured, with the anti-education Taliban militants being blamed. If not them, it was somebody like them. So religion has a lot of trauma to answer for. And to wrap up, I'll end with a brief word about the work of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. We are the largest association of freethinkers, atheists, and agnostics. What we like to joke, whatever you call yourselves, we all disbelieve in the same gods. We're the largest association of non-believers in North America. We have more than 35,000 dues-paying members, and we've grown from the original 2 of us, volunteers, to a staff of about 27, and that includes a legal department of 10 attorneys who end a couple hundred major entanglements between religion and government in the United States each year through writing complaint letters, legal complaint letters alone. We try to end violations through education and persuasion, where the law is on our side in the United States. We have a godless, secular constitution. We have quite a bit of good case law against religion in the schools, but we are constantly mopping up. And when that doesn't work and the circumstances are ripe, we then go to court, and we have taken well over 70 lawsuits, ending many substantial violations of religion in government and protecting school children in many cases. Just last week, we won a 6-year lawsuit against the arch-conservative Christian nationalist governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. He told us specifically at FFRF not to mess with Texas. He censored our free-thinking display at the Texas Capitol while permitting a Christian nativity scene, and the court agreed that our free speech rights were violated. We just won that case a week ago. Earlier in April, we successfully settled our lawsuit with the state of Alabama, and the state of Alabama had a religious test for people wanting to vote. If you wanted to register to vote, you had to sign a form saying, "So help me God." If you didn't sign it, you couldn't vote. And our Constitution, our secular Constitution, specifically outlaws religious tests for public office. Obviously, you can't have a religious test if you need to vote. So we ended that religious test to register to vote in April. And in another recent lawsuit, we ended a violation in Puerto Rican schools. It's our first case in Puerto Rico, where elementary school children were being forced to attend 40-minute-long prayers every other week to start the school day. They were forced to stand out in the heat and listen to Christian prayers about Jesus, even though our public schools in the United States are not supposed to indoctrinate. So that's the kind of thing we've been doing for 40 years. We also have a radio show and podcast called Freethought Radio. We have a TV show called Freethought Matters. And we have a show that is, live on Facebook every Wednesday called Ask an Atheist. You can find these on FFRF's YouTube channel. We publish a newspaper, Freethought Today. And we have a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., and are working with the Congressional Freethought Caucus. And we have billboard campaigns, and we generally do what we can to educate the public about non-theism, about the separation between religion and government, how vital it is to keep religion out of government, and to improve the image of non-believers. We have still struggle with a lot of stigma in the United States toward non-belief. We want to make public officials aware that today we comprise more than a quarter of the U.S. population. We work so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail because we truly believe that freedom depends on free thinkers. And someday I hope there won't be a need for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. We want to do ourselves out of a job. And I hope there won't be a need for conferences on religious trauma, because I hope our society will have evolved beyond belief, that more and more children will be allowed to grow up free from religious indoctrination and be encouraged to think critically. I look forward to the day when more and more of us will choose to reject unverified claims and the supernatural and eschew blind belief and quit imposing it on young minds. I want us to concentrate not on some unseen, unknown, unprovable deity or spirit world, and instead devote ourselves to enjoying and improving and saving this world, our only world. As I like to say, the only afterlife that should concern any of us is leaving our planet and our descendants a secure and pleasant future. So thank you so much for including me in your very important conference to make things better for those suffering from the trauma of religion.
Wow. Thank you so much, Annie Laurie. I'm really glad that you were able to talk to us today. I had no idea all the different things that you folks are involved with at Freedom from Religion Foundation. That's just amazing. You're doing a tremendous service. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. Alice says, in which of the U.S. states do you see the greatest threat and violation of women's rights?
Well, that's a good question. It's in a lot of states. We see the most state church violations in the South. And I would say that more of the there's Midwest states that are passing anti-abortion bans left and right. I live in the state of Wisconsin, which is generally considered a progressive state, but our legislature is not progressive. And we have a ban on abortion rights, for example, that if a doctor would perform an abortion, he has to go to prison for 6 years. Ever since Roe versus Wade was passed in 1973, we have been unable to get the legislature to repeal that draconian prohibition that dates to the 1840s, if you can believe it. We did finally get them to repeal a provision that women don't go to prison for having an abortion. And so that law is still on the books. And the goal is to bring cases up to the U.S. Supreme Court where they would turn it back. The likely scenario is that they would probably not ban it altogether. They would turn it back to the states to decide, call it a states' rights issue, which we've heard that before with civil rights. That's always a bad sign. So even in the state of Wisconsin, I mean, we're looking at a lot of states that have similar archaic provisions that would be the law if the Supreme Court were to turn it back to the states. But that's a very good question. I'm going to have to do a little research on that, because there's a lot of federal rights that are protected. We have a state and federal system, as you do in Canada. And so I don't know which state fares the worst. I imagine it is a southern state.
So then what would you recommend? How could people get involved in their state if they're concerned by the big push that the religious right seems to have on right now to restrict women's reproductive rights? How can people get involved with that? I mean, certainly they could be and should be supporting your foundation. What else could they do?
Well, we do send out, the Freedom from Religion Foundation sends out action alerts to our members and also to anybody who signs up for them. We have a phone to action. You can go to our website under news and look for the action alerts. There are a plethora of abortion rights groups, many of them with chapters in states. I mean, people need to speak out as citizens. And if you live near a capital, you want to go to it. But when you're dealing in some states where you have, and we are a nonpartisan group, but if you have a state legislature that's entirely Republican, the governor's Republican, this stuff's unstoppable. We have to look to the courts at that point, and so far they are upholding our rights. But President Trump, unfortunately, had the opportunity to appoint a third of our federal judiciary and a third of our U.S. Supreme Court. And the last appointment he made, Amy Coney Barrett, has really tipped it over. And we don't know how long it will take, but we assume, unless we get some court reform and expansion, that Roe versus Wade, I've had court experts tell me they don't think Roe versus Wade will still be intact on its 50th anniversary, which would be 1923. Wow. We're in a very serious situation in the United States. And, we have now a liberal president and Democratic slight control of the House, but there's a lot at stake here, and so getting involved in any of these things, even the voting suppression, is something to. If you want to defend rights in the United States, we have to oppose that. So stay alert, stay vigilant.
Yeah. Wow. And what about things like on your money, or I think on the new Mississippi flag about saying "In God We Trust"? Is that something that would be worth folks going after?
It's always worth complaining. We have taken at FFRF. We have sued over in this motto, "In God We Trust." It was not the original motto. The original motto in the United States is "E pluribus unum," from many come one, which is very aspirational, but I love it. And it's still on the money, and it's still a motto, but it's more or less been supplanted by the Cold War era "In God We Trust" motto. And it wasn't on the currency until the late 1950s. A lot of this happened in the 50s. We have a Pledge of Allegiance where "Under God" was inserted. Yes. Many groups have sued. We've sued over these things. We haven't made any headway. But it's always worth complaining. We have a stamp that you can put on U.S. money. One of them says, in reason we trust, and one of them says, in science we trust. So, educate, educate, educate.
Wow.
But yes, it was very unfortunate that with this terrible Confederate flag in Mississippi, and then they got rid of it, and then they put "In God We Trust" on it. So, unfortunate to replace it with another motto that also turns some people into outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Well, we have another question, if you don't mind. Anne asks if you have any thoughts on Oprah Winfrey's use of spirituality and her influence.
Well, Oprah Winfrey is really a smart person. She's really clever. She's probably a genius. But I think that as she became famous, she felt that she had to show that she was humble by embracing religion, and she has certainly embraced it big time. I don't know what her personal views are. I do know that my mother and I were on a show in I think it was 83 in Baltimore called People Are Talking.
Right.
She was on with an older man, white man, who was the host, and the topic of that show was, "Is the Bible sexist?" And he turned the show over to her, and so she later used that to audition to get her show in Chicago. Yeah. And at that time, some of her people were telling us, "Oprah loves you. Oprah loves you. She's going to have you on all the time," because we were on that show with her, and she really got to shine. And she seemed to eat up our criticism of religion. Maybe she was just a good show woman, and she knew it was good for TV. She seemed to enjoy our criticism of religion at that time. I don't have a lot of insight, except I think she has she's very successful, has a lot of money, and maybe she feels she has to thank God instead of herself for her success. So she doesn't appear to be too proud. I don't know.
Right. And she is hugely influential still after all these years. I see one more question. What are the common anti-women themes across the main religions?
Well, the Abrahamic religions, of course, share what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible in common. So, almost anything in the Mosaic Law, is shared in common, and that's women aren't worth as much. We're property. We can be enslaved longer. The rape, barbaric rape laws, that you could, if you're a virgin on your wedding night, you can be stoned to death. These things still happen in Muslim countries. And then there's a lot of Christians who think, "Oh, isn't that ghastly?" Well, it's out of their Bible. So anything that's in a lot of that Mosaic law is all shared in common. And Eve, is still shared in common. Certainly with the Jewish and Christian traditions, they're the same.
And so I think you did mention Hinduism a little bit earlier as well, and I'm afraid I just don't know that much about Hinduism, but is it repressive to women as well?
Well, it is, in fact, yes. I mean, I've certainly been told by some Hindu believers, "Oh, we have lots of gods and goddesses," and this is true. But the situation of the legal status of women in India has been very low, and even continues to be very, very low. And they've, of course, the shame of menstruation. There in Nepal, for example, that's where a lot of girls drop out of school, and the rape cases right now have been, an uptick in rape cases. So it depends on what caste you're in, I guess. But Hinduism does not uplift women. None of the patriarchal religions uplift women.
So true.
And I assume that especially when there's people who are raised in these religions or trying to help people who have had trauma from these religions. I mean, this is the legacy. This is where the trauma comes from. It's the Bible, and if you're a woman, you are subservient, and this remains a huge issue in our society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Blaming the women, and I know that you heard from Alice Gretchen, for example,
Mm-hmm.
talking about, how she almost got married off completely against her will because she was supposed to be a dutiful daughter, and God wills it. It didn't matter what she thought. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
quite a religion to be raised in.
Oh, yes. I know that I had a man approach me when I was still very Pentecostal. He approached me at church, and he assured me that he had heard from God, and that God had told him that I was to be his wife, and we were to get married and travel back to Ghana, where he was from, and we were to live there, and I was to help him, save his group, his people group. And I thought, well, that's funny, because I'm sure God would have a way of getting that message to me besides you. But it was really uncomfortable. It was really uncomfortable. And that, I think, is one of the first times way far back that made me start thinking, maybe something's not quite right here.
I think with Alice, in her book Wayward, and she talks about how the problem was that she was so dutiful and loving and wanted to be accepted by everybody, but she was never hearing God talk to her. So this was not an uncommon occurrence with her. People were always telling her what God wanted her to do. Yeah. She wasn't hearing it, and she was so young. Mm-hmm. But you can see, at least she spoke. Her mother helped her, and she spoke up. Imagine what would have happened to her. And, the Mormon religion teaches young girls, be sweet.
Yes.
And we need to be rebellious instead of being sweet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And yes, teaching females that they must obey men. I mean, and anyone in authority, really, but certainly that's where we see sexual abuse being so rampant in church groups, and predators seeking positions of leadership and power over flocks who are told that they must be obedient. And then there's also secret keeping and shame, because we're not supposed to say anything that would cast this person in a bad light. It's very insidious, and we really need to be teaching our children definitely about their own power and their own rights over their bodies. We actually had one more question just pop in, so I'm going to ask you real quick. What resources can you recommend to help grandparents to help undo and heal some of the religious trauma we inflicted on our adult children?
Oh. Yeah, so I'm assuming this is somebody who raised their children religious, and the children it took, and now they are regretting it. Well, of course, modeling how you model yourselves, and not being afraid to at least let slip how you feel about religion. You can do it indirectly, like some people think this and some people think that, and this is what I think. Not being afraid of at least saying something, that I don't happen to believe that, or I think that you should always have evidence before you believe something, or gee, Nana and I don't believe in God, and we think we're good people. I think you have, at some point, you have to be a little candid. There are certainly books out there. I can hawk my husband's book, Just Pretend, a Freethought book for children, that we have on our website. And then there's the Stardust books by Bailey Harris and now her sister, Elle the Humanist. These are written by children for other children. And they have resources at their website. They even have a board game now. But I think mostly cognitive dissonance is a very good thing for children, and they do pick up on it. mean, if you censor yourself and you never are candid about anything, they won't. But, if they just see you're modeling it and finding occasions when you're watching the news or looking at the newspaper, or they bring something up to make a comment so they know how you feel. That isn't indoctrinational. It's just letting them know what you think. I think that is a huge impact. And also, you just can't underestimate their respect, the respect they have for you and the love they have for you. It will open some doors. And at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the greatest number of our members were raised in a household where one parent was religious and one parent wasn't. And that cognitive dissonance is a very good thing to get people thinking, children thinking. So don't be afraid of it.
Fascinating. Thank you. Those are some great words of advice. And we're pretty much at the end of this session. This has been so interesting getting to talk with you today. Thank you so much, Annie Laurie.
Again, thrilled that you're doing this. I'm just sorry it needs to be done, but such an important thing to recognize the concept of religious trauma.
Thank you again, Annie Laurie.